1978 to 1981, and again in 1991-92. His first full-time position as a minister was with Olinda, and he feels a special relationship with this congregation, which nurtured him in his new profession. He was also married in the Olinda Church. After leaving Olinda, Conrad served Unitarian Universalist churches in Honolulu, Saskatoon, and Sheffield, England. He then decided to change careers and became a teacher. He taught first as a primary teacher and then in adult education. He taught for many years with the Canadian Auto Workers Union, now Unifor, and finished his education career teaching English to newcomers to Canada. He is now retired, living in Windsor and looking forward to when he will be able to travel again. Conrad is always warmly welcomed at Olinda. In addition to giving the talk this morning, Conrad will give the reading and he will stay for coffee hour after the service. We begin our service this morning with a prelude by the Baylis Stone Trio. You are unmuted. Please begin.
Okay, everyone can hear me fine? Yep, okay. They were called the Stacks, the primary shelving unit for the library at the University of California at Berkeley, one of the major libraries of the world. The Stacks had a character all of their own. Access to them was limited to faculty, graduate students, visiting scholars, and library personnel. Hundreds of thousands of books with narrow aisles in between and surprisingly few people. The Stacks did not have floors. Instead, they had tiers. Many years ago, each floor had been divided horizontally into two tiers so that the ceilings were very low, touchable. The tiers were made of glass, a mottled translucent glass, which you could not see through, but if there was someone on the tier just above you, you could see the soles of their shoes, black silhouettes just above your head. You could also get occasional glimpses of people on the tier above or below by standing very close to the shelves. For the shelving was continuous vertically, not ending at each tier, but rather uniting the whole building along an axis which extended from the nether regions below to the highest heavens. For a few years, I had a study carrel, a metal cubicle with a wooden chair down on the very lowest tier of the Stacks. I very rarely saw another person down there on tier 1. People just didn't come down there very often, at least not on purpose. It was a desolate land of outcasts, exiles, and a few lost souls looking for a way back into the real world, which was only possible on tier 4. The books on tier 1, they were outcasts too. Most of the books were PL 480 books, volumes which the library received in monthly doses from India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. The United States had made a deal with these countries some time back, known as Public Law 480, in which it promised to purchase copies of everything, literally everything, printed by any state or federal publishing house in any of these countries. It was a way for these countries to offset some of their debt to the United States. All of the PL 480 books in English were separated from the rest and cataloged by the library. All the rest in Hindi, in Urdu, in Sinhalese, and in numerous different languages were simply deposited onto the shelves of tier 1, uncatalogued and unordered. Occasionally, I could observe an employee putting PL 480 books onto the shelves, but I never saw anyone take one off except myself. The only other books on tier 1 were double folios and triple folios, all grossly oversized books which couldn't fit on the shelves where they belonged and were therefore exiled to tier 1, where they lay heavily and disarranged. If there is a hell for bad books, this was it. And it was there, amid the dust-colored, dust-odored air and the low drone of elevator engines, with jet black feet walking just above my head, and with thousands of never read books surrounding me, where I began to get some first inklings of a meaning of salvation. One afternoon or morning, one could never be quite sure which it was when buried on tier 1, I decided that I had worked too many hours on a term paper, so I ambled over to the triple folio section to pick up where I had left off. It had become my own private library to be used on breaks. I even had a paper marker, never disturbed by anyone else, to show my progress as I methodically went through these mammoth books like a paleontologist marking the bones of some yet to be constructed dinosaur. Yet this day was a little different. For even in the lowliest of places, we are sometimes struck by a new revelation. A huge book lay before me on the floor, which was the only place large enough for me to read it. Facing me were immense, detailed, hand-colored, black and white photographs of Istanbul at the beginning of the 1900s. The pictures were of prominent sites of the city, but in some I could also see children playing in the streets, and in one photograph there was a beggar just barely visible in a darkened doorway at the very edge of the print, a beggar of whom I still wonder whether the editing eye of the photographer missed him or saw him standing there. I was moved by these grand pictures of a very foreign city. On the inside back cover of the book, a yellowed circulation slip was neatly pasted. There were no marks upon it. I turned the heavy pages back to the front of the book, where a University of California stamp told me that the book had been acquired in 1921. And I realized that in all of those years, the book had never been checked out, not once, not by anyone. Quite likely no patron had ever looked inside of it, and perhaps no one besides me, not even the photographer, had ever seen that beggar standing in the doorway. Now, the book was quite a handful with its heavy photographic paper. I had to awkwardly cradle it in both arms as I lugged it up to the checkout aisle on tier 4. I felt a bit of a cold shiver as I watched the innocent student employee methodically stamp a date in the back. Of course, he had no idea what he was really doing. Then I walked the book out into the library and around the desk over to the return book deposit slot and slid it into the slot. Only it didn't fit, so I had to leave it on top of the counter. In a few days, it found its own way back down to the tier 1 sorting shelves, from where I personally took it back to its proper place on the shelf, right next to my paper marker. But before I put it back, I opened the back cover. There, clearly marked in black ink, were these significant words. Due 30 days after the date stamped, May 2nd, 1972. And below that, in majestic purple ink, returned May 2nd, 1972. The book was truly saved. Not only had someone used it for the purpose for which it had been created, but that fulfillment was also physically marked upon it in a way that could be universally recognized. After that day, I spent many of my breaks wandering throughout all of the tiers of the library looking for books to save. It did not really matter what they were about. My only criterion was that no one had used them for at least 50 years. I would take the books home for a few days so that the checkout and return dates would not be identical, which might suggest some kind of accidental borrowing rather than a true one. I would always read in the books a little bit to find out what they were about. And thus the stamp of use was honest and not a sham. And I saved many books that year. A number of years later, I happened to be stuck overnight in the city of Sacramento, California. I had a place to sleep, but it was such a hovel that I chose to walk around the city until I was very sleepy. I passed a man sitting in a park. "Hey, buddy," he called out to me, "what's the hurry?" I hesitated. "You got a minute?" "Sure," I said. He was living on the street. He talked about his wife and children. He hadn't seen his son in 12 years. "I'm just an old wino, I know, it's all my own doing, but it don't mean that it don't hurt sometimes. Like I kind of wonder what my boy is doing." And we talked for about an hour. "Thanks," he said when I finally chose to leave. "You know, I ain't never told this to no one before. Thanks." At the time, I did not think of the unused, unread, and unfulfilled books in the library, but I have since. I walked on alone along the street paralleling the park. Someone else called out to me, "Hey, buddy, do you have a quarter you could spare?" I raised my gaze and saw that there were quite a few homeless men in the park, some in groups, some alone, Tier 1 Sacramento. But it could have been anywhere, a place where people get deposited when they don't fit onto the normal shelves of our society. There were people there who might not get checked out by anyone who cared. People who might never again be cradled in someone's arms, however awkwardly, however fleetingly. What power we have to stamp little marks of our presence upon another's life, and how breathtakingly important are others' marks upon us. There is salvation in the human touch, salvation in the human connection. Years later, I got another job in a library quite different from that of the University of California. I was hired to begin the process of reactivating an old library in a Benedictine seminary in Oakland, California. My sole duties were to keep the door open and to be present for a few hours to serve the patrons in whatever they needed. Yet, the patrons rarely came, as the library had been closed for 12 years and no one was in the habit of using it. Alone, my attention soon became directed towards the books, covered with spider webs, thick dust, and abandonment. I began the cleaning, the revival, shelf by shelf, feeling again a sense of salvation around me. Then, unexpectedly, a small card escaped like a soul from one of the buried books. as I handled it, the bookmark of some aspiring priest marking a special mass. And Ray, could you show the slide if possible? There it is.
Oh.
To me, it was a treasure. It was a mark of salvation. You can take the slide down if you wish. Thanks. To me, it was a treasure, a mark of salvation. A short time later, a second card descended upon me from a book that I was moving on a top shelf. And then another. And then suddenly I was being blessed with a shower of cards, obviously sent down from the heavens above to mark this period of renewal and jubilation. If you want to show the next slide, Ray. It's just a sample of some of them that were falling. And I kept them all, have probably 40 of them. Thanks, picture can go down. These cards mark another kind of salvation. The discovery of those amazing little treasures which lay hidden within our leathern covers. People are full of unseen treasures. We are full of them ourselves. Sometimes they are simple treasures, sometimes they are more profound. They surface within transitions from being closed to becoming open, being untouched to becoming cradled. They surface when relationships are formed, decisions are made, or change is taking place. Within these transitions, we often discover unrealized talents and resources within ourselves, see with a different vision, or feel emotions that had been dormant. And as such, we release these little treasures that we have kept within our pages of experience, and thus feel this form of salvation. What is salvation? Here I am talking about checking out old books, stopping to talk with strangers in the city, and dusting off old libraries of personal potential. Not the kind of salvation generally discussed today. The word salvation comes from the same Latin root as the word salvage. And my stories of salvation this morning are more about salvaging than they are about transcending. I believe that the resources for salvation are all around us and within us, in things overlooked or not fully seen, in crannies yet to be explored, treasures yet to be unearthed, hands yet to be touched, and in feelings yet to be resolved. The root of both salvage and salvation is salus, which in Latin means safe, whole, and healthy. Salvage is the reviving of health, the restoring to wholeness, the retaining of the best. Salvage is about being saved. When I was a child, long before I began saving books from an eternal shelf life, I used to take periodic trips with my family to the Peck Road wrecking yard, a huge depository for the potentially saleable pieces of buildings demolished throughout the Los Angeles region. Again, it was rather like a type of paleontology, with the bones of extinct buildings strewn randomly throughout the site, many even buried beneath the remains of more recent mammoths meeting the same fate as their forerunners. My father was big on salvaging. For many years, he worked fixing up the old house in which we lived. Fixing up usually meant the finding of usable bits of buildings from the Peck Road wrecking yard, and then somehow integrating them into our home. There were some beautiful things that were thus saved via the salvage yard. Our living room was paneled in old solid wood doors with the thick sun-cracked paint simply varnished over, giving them the appropriate feeling of dinosaur hide. We found porcelain doorknobs, brass plumbing fixtures, tongue and groove flooring, purple, sun-tinted glass. I thus grew up surrounded by expressions of salvation without even realizing it. Salvation is salvage in bringing the luster back to a tarnished relationship, in replacing a worn gear so that a broken pattern of behavior becomes smooth running again, in finding the missing part, which makes us whole again. In these we are saved, in these we become more healthy, more whole. Of course, I am playing with the word salvation a bit today, stretching its definition to explore the breadth of its meaning, sensing that there is more to this concept than what is conveyed through its common usage. Today, the word salvation is more or less owned by the religious right and describes either a post-mortem release from suffering or a sudden conversion to fundamentalist Christianity, which in itself applies the same eventual release from suffering. To me, salvation similarly means a release from suffering, only I consider this to be a worldly ideal rather than an otherworldly one. The pathway to salvation lies in becoming more healthy and more whole, emotionally, spiritually, humanly. The resources for our salvation are right here within our human reach and right here among our human interactions whenever we tune into the personal and interpersonal truths of living. Salvation is a lifetime journey, but we did not have to wait until death to experience it. We are saved. We are saved over and over again, or can be saved, by discovering in where we are the connections of the moment that will take us further along towards where we want to go, towards our wholeness, towards our health. It doesn't even matter all that much where we are. Back when I was wandering around the desolate isles of Tier 1, it was relatively easy for those who did not belong there to find salvation. Occasionally, when someone accidentally came down to that nether region looking for the real exit, I could simply point them towards the elevator and explain that the release from their suffering was really on Tier 4. No one ever came back, and my assumption was that all were saved. But for me, I sought no such relief, no such release. Tier 1 was the place where I belonged, and my salvation in that place involved a process of immersion rather than one of escape. A path to salvation is everywhere. There are unlimited connections which can be made wherever we are. We are each showered with unsolicited bookmarks, gifts of connection to other people and places and things and times, blessings which can carry us another step forward along our way towards health. We are always surrounded by possibilities, and yet it is too easy to make no connection at all, too easy to touch no one, too easy to go nowhere. Our salvation depends upon our conscious and creative choices to see the treasures which lie beneath the dust, to hear the human truths even within broken lives, to find those connections which lead to healing, or in other words, to salvage the meaningful hidden beneath the strata of the everyday. Thank you.
Thank you, Conrad.